Welcome to Analogue Space Mission class number 3. Today we're going to be talking about analog astronauts. How are they different from astronauts? What are the trainings? What are the roles? And what do they just do in a daily day during a mission? So the first thing to ask is, are analog astronauts astronauts? We're going to go a bit more in depth, but just in general, the selection process is not the same for analog astronauts as it is for astronauts. It's not the same complete objective, which is one of the reasons why it's not as selective, and the training is therefore also not as intense, and available facilities for the missions are very, very different. So no, analog astronauts are not astronauts, but you do have astronauts who had to prepare, and therefore they were analog astronauts. Some people also say that, you could consider an analog astronaut as an astronaut. Why? Because you're trying to go to space, you're training. Some people who are astronauts, who were selected by NASA, never got to fly, for example. Would you still say that they're not astronauts? Obviously, you can debate this, but just in general, an analog astronaut does not undergo the same training, the same selection process. And is the same selection process applied for all analog missions? As we saw, there's over 20 of them existing from NASA, ESA, but also which are non-agency related analog space missions. So do you always have to be recruited the same way? And the answer is no. It really, really depends how long your mission is, what is the budget, what is the objective of the mission. The mission objective can really, really change depending on what the habitat is like, what the budget is like, and what just the team wants to do. So no, the selection process is not the same. But we can still have a look at some of the existing selection processes and what would be the requirements and qualification you'd expect from analog astronauts. At least if you want to take part in it, you expect your teammates to be in that general level of selection. As I mentioned, not all analog astronauts will be astronauts, but all astronauts have had some trainings and have to perform some analog missions in the sense that they had to prepare for their mission in space. And for example, Buzz Aldrin was no exception. Here you can see him testing his spacesuits in microgravity. Microgravity is not something you usually have in analog space missions because obviously it costs a lot of money and it's more dangerous. The advantage of analog space missions is that you can test a lot of space missions, but just without a huge cost and the danger. So obviously suborbital flights are not the main focus of the majority of them, but you also have to do it, for example, if you're going to be an astronaut. One thing that you can also test in microgravity is just how seasick do you get. Some astronauts are sick for like a few days, some a few hours. It really just varies, and it can just tell you, are you going to be performing well right away or not. So it's a good test to do, and it's also a good test to see, is your spacesuit actually useful? Like, is it easy to move in it? Normally you can do testing in neutral buoyancy labs, so underwater, where you have the International Space Station model, for example, if that's where you're going. But obviously in that case they were testing just microgravity effects and how he was moving in a KC-135 aircraft back in 1969. So this is an example that you can see, well, yeah, they do have those astronauts who are analog astronauts. And here you can see a recruitment image from Asclepios 1. Asclepios is a student-led analog space missions made for students, by students, mostly based in Switzerland, but international project. And that is actually how I personally got into the analog space mission world. 3 years ago, in October 2019, this image was put on social media, LinkedIn, etc. And of course, I saw the word astronaut. I was like, yes, of course. Sometimes it's a good way to recruit people. You tell them you want to become an astronaut, and then you have to read in small letters, there's lunar mission simulation or just simulation. But this is basically how you kind of recruit people. Obviously, you sometimes know existing analog astronauts, but the goal would be that, everybody who wants to actually participate and can provide, work of quality should be able to come and become an analog astronaut. So this was the first clue I had about analog space missions and how the recruitment was going. And then you apply. And how do you apply for analog space missions? Well, at least for this particular one, let's compare with the one from ESA. ESA, European Space Agency, for example, if you look at the recruitment that they had last year, you had to send a CV and motivation letter, just a standard for, any job. Additionally, they this time asked for a small medical evaluation, the ones that pilots would have to have. And you also had to fill a small questionnaire. So obviously the questionnaire was a way to filter your CV. So for example, have you got over 3 years of expertise after your master's degree? If you read the CV, obviously the information is there, but sometimes you have this small questionnaire. Then I had a cognitive, motor, technical, and personality test. Then you've got psychometric and group and individual tests. So you go to those second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth exams or evaluations only if you were successful on the first step, obviously. And then there was a medical review. So this is really the full medical review. You got a panel interview. They also check your criminal record, and then you've got a last interview with the head of agencies, etc., etc. So very long, tedious process. Now that is not the norm for analog space missions. For most analog space missions, you have CV, motivation letter, and you have medical tests, usually the level of a PADI test, so scuba diving test, because a lot of scuba diving can actually take place in the training to prepare for a mission. So the scuba diving test is quite like round, so it should be sufficient to know that you're fine. A psychological evaluation is also good, but usually if you are doing scuba diving, it's quite likely that you should be stable and you're not going to be the kind of person that would freak out easily. But we'll talk more about this a bit later. Now if we compare ESA to Asclepios, or at least Asclepios 1, they were trying to get the recruitment for the analog space mission quite close to the ESA recruitment. Why? Well, you want people who are really motivated, people who are genuinely ready, that would actually, the next step or the step at the same time, would be to send the motivation letter and CV to ESA. So why not train them also for the real thing, for the real selection? And that's what happened. CV, motivation letter, once you pass that, you got a video in English. Why in English? Because most of the missions are conducted in English, so it's good to speak that language. And obviously if you've got problems communicating, you could be the most talented person, in the end you're working as a team, you're not working alone, so you have to speak English. Another thing that you can evaluate in those videos, so you basically ask a few questions like, do you like space, why do you want to do this mission? You can assess the kind of motivation they have. Is it intrinsic or is it extrinsic? Is it that you are pushed by something outside of you? Is it inner motivation really, or like you like science, you like space, you want to be an analog astronaut? Or is it that you want people to like you, you want people to think that you're doing something cool, or you want to please your family, whatever it is. If it comes from within you, then it's perfect. Why? Because it's not an easy thing. Analog space missions are not in your comfort zone. That's the point. The whole point is that you get outside your comfort zone, you're guinea pig for science, and we get data out of you. If you're just trying to impress someone, you're gonna have a bad time most likely, because you're gonna need that well of motivation in you to do the mission. So this is something that you can already assess partly. And then if you pass that, you do cognitive tests. So they're very similar to the one you'd have at ESA, but also if you, for example, doing a civilian pilot or military pilot tests. So some of them are just 3D visualization, mathematics, just base STEM knowledge. So for example, can you read an electrical circuit? You don't need to do very advanced math. It's stuff that you would have done in high school, and if you have just a basic knowledge of science. So you do not need to be somebody with a background in STEM per se. You don't need to be a genius. You just need to have common sense and common education. And obviously if you have problems with, motor and cognitive issues, it's quite likely that you won't be able to perform everything on time. And time is actually of the essence doing missions. You can't spend years and years and years in space, and you can't spend years and years and years in analog facilities unless you really sign up for this, but usually it costs a bit of money and you are volunteer. So again, you want things to be as akin as into space, and you want them to be efficient. So you want people who perform cognitively quite high. And lastly, if you pass all of this, was a psychiatric evaluation, and that's obviously of utmost importance, not just so that you don't behave like an idiot and rudely to your crew, but actually so that you're not a danger. I mean, some of the bases are not accessible easily. Like it can take half an hour or an hour for a helicopter or a plane or the ambulance to come to you. So if all your crew will start stabbing each other, that's a no-go. And you're going to put them under isolation, you're going to put them under a lot of stress, you're going to put them under a heavy workload. So any form of instability can actually lead to something much bigger, and much bigger than it would be if you had them just in their room stressing over maybe some exam or something. Why? Because also the people around them will have more problems helping them. It's not a normal situation. It's far away in isolation. You won't be able to just, call your parents, call a friend right away. You have to be able to deal with this. So you cannot be put in a habitat with other people that you might endanger or might endanger you. So you have to do this psychiatric evaluation. Obviously, you don't need to be 100% perfect, but you need to make sure that there's no big problem. Then the other test that you do is group tests. You could be the smartest person in the world. If you don't behave well with your comrades, the mission will fail. You're not going to have a good time, they're not going to have a good time, and it's going to be a waste of time and space. So obviously, teamwork, really important. And this is something that, sadly, with both the video and doing the psychiatric evaluation, you don't necessarily see. It's something that you really see when you put people in a group and you have maybe leaders and people with followers and people with just very different personalities. And that's how you can also create your team. When you select people as a group, you try not to get necessarily all the same personality. You're going to try to get a mismatch, a balance of different people, because that's how you're going to get the most efficient mission, and also they're going to have the most pleasure. And then lastly, a little interview with an astronaut. That's always a plus. That's not at all a given doing analog space missions recruitment. For Asclepios, that was the case, and obviously astronauts who've been to space are the best to assess, well, that person seems well not. Why? Because they've literally been there. They can see if you have the right stuff, or at least during that time they can try to evaluate it. So yeah, so this is one of the toughest recruitment styles you have in analog space missions, but some of them are a little bit tougher. The majority are easier. The majority is more like a medical test, a small psychological evaluation, CV, motivation letter, and that's it. Now, what do you need to have? Like, if you were tomorrow to apply as an analog astronaut, what would you want on your CV, and what would you expect also from your crewmate? So you really have to think, actually, I don't want to be in a tin can with that person. That person is a no-go. Well, you have to have basic knowledge of experiments, space maintenance, and communication devices. If you've never used a computer before, if you've never used a walkie-talkie, and you have problems learning how to use those tools, it's going to be problematic. Obviously, space missions and analog space mission are very high-tech. So if you don't use those communication devices, you won't be able to perform if you're not ready to learn quickly. So the more you know how to use computers, walkie-talkies, some random machines performing experiments, the better, obviously. Doesn't mean that you need to know how to repair trucks, doesn't mean you need to build rockets, always a plus, but you're not going to throw any rockets anyway, so we don't need per se a rocket scientist. It's actually quite good if you have in your crew different people with different types of knowledge. You can have a astrophysicist, a geologist, biologist, but also people who did, for example, communication devices, and psychologists. You need a bit of everything, as long as everybody has a basic knowledge, a basic know-how, and common sense. Common sense is really the most important thing that you need. Then language skills. Obviously, if the whole crew is, for example, British and most missions are in English, then it's fine. You don't need high language skills. Obviously, you need to be able to communicate. Some missions are, for example, an astronaut is doing the first mission all in Spanish, are in another language, but it's quite rare. usually you have very, very international crews. And that's why it's nice to speak other languages, you know. Obviously, from an administrative standpoint and for all official communication, it's going to be mostly in English. But for example, if you're in a country, or if you come from a different country and you want to talk to the media, talking in your native language and then switching to another one helps. The other thing is, if, for example, you're trying to assess the well-being of your crew, one of your crewmates doesn't speak the best English, they can sometimes feel a bit tired, would like to speak in their mother tongue again. If you or somebody else in your crew speaks that language, it actually helps. It helps in forging connections. It helps in understanding also other cultures. So being international or being very aware of cultures and languages is always a plus in missions. Also, you know, you never know if you might be using a device that was sent from a different country where the instructions might be in the initial language. We might require you to translate. Hopefully not. But obviously it's this kind of side knowledge that could be quite useful. And you have to think that, you know, astronauts, when they go on the ISS, they used to come up with Soyuz. And Soyuz is all written in Russian. So if you're not Russian, you need to learn. And some of the modules are built by JAXA, or others by the US, others are European modules. Knowing all those languages is really a way to also put yourself into the mindset of becoming an analog astronaut and then an astronaut. Then background in STEM. Obviously, you're going to perform a lot of experiments. Analog space missions, they, you know, send lots of experiments, so you can bring your own. You don't need per se to be a scientist in engineering, biology, math, whatever it is, but it does really help, because we will understand what is it to work in a lab, what is it to have proper scientific etiquette. You have needs from medical doctors. It's always useful to have one in the base. For them, it's also usually very, very interesting, because you both do extreme medicine and isolation medicine, and, you know, evaluation on the psychological aspects. So for that reason, medical doctors are usually quite interesting. It's quite often that you have them in the crew, but they're not necessary. You can still be a journalist, you can be an artist, you can be somebody else, but you need to be ready to learn how to perform experiments and learn how to get really outside of your knowledge range. Love and passion for space. That is something that is, I think, not always 100% a prerequisite, but very important still. Because you're going to be in a tin can for like a day, 2 days, 2 weeks, a month, maybe a year and a half. If you don't have motivation and love for the project, it's not going to go necessarily well. You could be interested in the science side of things. A lot of analog astronauts want to be astronauts, but it's not necessarily all of them. Some of them are just interested in the experience of isolation and helping this. But if you have, in addition, passion for space, then you will be even more engaged in the project. If we can see that, you know, you have expertise in space, you worked on an aerospace project, well, not only will you help in making the project more real, more lifelike, but also you will be much more engaged into the project. So not a prerequisite, but still something that people look at if you're applying. If you're capable to work in a stressful environment, then it's perfect. If you are not capable, then we're not going to take you. Obviously, the workload is usually quite high. If you panic, if you're disorganized, if the quality of your work is being impaired because of this, then it's not good. It's not good at all. You have to realize that you're not alone in this. People prepare those missions for years or for months, and if you mess them up, then it has consequences for your life and for their lives. If you panic and you cannot perform correctly, then you might also endanger your crew. So being able to work in a stressful environment and within a team are really, they need it. If you cannot deal with stress, then you're not fit for that team. Experience in dangerous environment is a plus, not in the sense that we'd like you to be a daredevil. If you're always being an adrenaline junkie, you might get a bit bored in a habitat for weeks, and we don't want you to go crash a rover just for fun. But you have to have a bit of experience just so you know how you react. If when you're in isolation and maybe something happens, it's the first time you're confronted to danger, it's difficult to assess how you're going to react. So for example, if you do skydiving, paragliding, scuba diving quite often, you already are used to dangerous environments. You're used to behaving in a, well, if you survived at least, probably, and most likely, you're used to performing correctly. You're used to following a protocol. You're used to looking for safety things, and that is very important because you're also responsible for a crew, right? So if you can provide an example, you can provide proof that you are used to those extreme environments and dangerous environments, and you can say, well, I had this happening to me and I behaved fine. I realized that I was actually okay with danger and I keep my head cool, then it's very, very positive, because it means, well, if anything happens during the mission, normally nothing happens, that's why we do those missions, but still, if anything happens, we already know, you also already know, you're already confident enough that you will stay calm and you will deal with it. Nothing really completely out of the ordinary should happen. It's not as if you would see anyone getting shot or anything, luckily, but still, like, it's important to have this knowledge, and it's also important to know that you're ready to get out of this. An example for me, I went paragliding 3 times, and the 3rd time I crashed. But before crashing, I had about 8 minutes where I knew that we could potentially crash and we could potentially die. And my reaction was to ask her, can I make a phone call? You know, and are we going to die? And I was very surprised. Obviously, it was sunny and beautiful, so maybe also it wasn't a very dramatic, it's not as in movies where you have music and everything. But the fact that I knew, oh, well, when something like this happens, and I know potentially I'm in very, very big danger because I'm 300 meters off the ground and you know, I'm not holding the paraglide. I can still keep my head cool, and that was an extremely important, probably part of what made me okay and suitable to be an analog astronaut. Then, leadership and communication skills. If you have 6, 7, 8 astronauts, or even 2 in a base, and they don't talk to each other, and they don't say when there's a problem, and they're not capable to talk to Mission Control Center, it's a problem. Big, big problem. I mean, why? Because things always go wrong. Not necessarily huge things, but there will always be a little part that's missing, something that's taking more time or less time. And if you're not capable of saying, well, look, I messed up, or there's something wrong, or we need to change this, or I'm unhappy, it's going to snowball. And in real life, when it snowballs, you can go out, have a hot chocolate, calm down, and you know, but you're not in real life. You are in a simulation, you are in isolation, you are far away from your family, your friends, and from also emergencies. So you have to communicate. If you're not able to say when there's a problem, then it's a no-go. And leadership also. And you'd think, well, only the person leading the mission should have. No. Every analog astronaut and every astronaut has their own role during a mission, and they have to be confident enough and have this, not completely, you know, role, but a little bit of leadership enough inside them that they can say, well, now I'm in charge. This is my field. This is what I have to do. The commander has nothing to say to, for example, the communications officer. The communications officer says, well, I need to take charge of this. Obviously, usually you talk to each other, but you know, that's their field. It's where they are the expert. This is where they have the leadership for that precise thing. And if you're not able to take on that leadership, then that's when you can have more problems also, because you will not communicate correctly, or you will let somebody take charge that should not be taking charge. It's not their domain, it's yours. You're responsible for this. So having this little leadership spark in you is important. You will never have the whole crew that are very, very strong leaders. You always have, you know, different levels. But in your field, you have to lead. In your field, you have to take charge. It's good to not have a criminal record. It's not always a prerequisite. In some missions it is, in others they don't ask. They just assume, well, you know, like you haven't done anything too bad, or if it was bad, well, by the time you apply, it should be cleared. So you should, you know, have done your time, whatever it is. So it's not always asked, but be ready just in case. And also, obviously, they ask for people to be healthy. Right now, there's obviously the para-astronaut program that's in development. So healthy does not necessarily mean that you not have handicaps and things like this, but it's just that in general you're not going to be in bed 10 hours a day, or you'll be able to function mostly on your own. We might have to adapt the habitats a bit for you. For example, if you've got a lower limb deficiency or if you're blind, but in general, it's just you don't want people, for example, to have a seizure in the middle of the mission. That's obviously can be very dangerous because we're far away. So it's in that regard that we want people to be healthy. The other reason is sometimes you have to perform quite, not necessarily heavy duty, but like hard work. For example, the spacesuits can be quite heavy, and you can't necessarily breathe really well in them. You have to carry stuff, you have to do sports every day to simulate, that you would be losing muscles and bone mass in microgravity, so you will be performing sports. If you can't do that, you actually might, again, spoil the mission. You might not manage to perform correctly. So being healthy also in that sense, you don't need to be an athlete, you don't need to be an Olympian, but you need to have a basic level of fitness so you can follow and not be a burden for the others. Lastly, being an adult. Obviously, if you're under 18, for insurance purposes, it can be quite difficult. There are some small missions that are sprouting in schools, but that they win the framework of the school. It's not a big thing, it's not in isolation necessarily, it's more like parts of a mission. Being 18 makes sure that, if anything happens to you, you're actually the one who's responsible. So you have to be ready when you apply for this to think, well, I need to apply as an adult. So let's go back to why the analog astronaut selection process is not the same as the astronaut selection process. Well, first, the medical requirements are not as tough for the analog space missions. Well, you're not in microgravity, you're not taking a rocket or a space shuttle. You don't have to be as fit. It's just not, you're not going through the same physical strain. Even if you do scuba diving, you'll never be in the same conditions as when you get 4 or 5 Gs in your face, and when you're actually really far and you need medical training. A lot of astronauts actually, astronauts want to be, when they get to the medical screening, they will see things they never knew, because you only get that when you get a full body scan, and it's not say something bad, or it's not something bad on Earth, but once they go to space, or they try to go to space, that's when it's actually problematic. This with analog space mission is not a problem. It's like you could have a small deformation somewhere. It's very unlikely that they would look for it and that it would actually manifest and create any problem in the conditions on Earth. Otherwise, it probably would have happened already, and it's not the analog space mission framework that caused it. STEM or pilot background are not always needed for analog space missions that we mentioned before. Whereas when you go to space, it's still very much like as for working, not as tourists obviously, but for working it's still pretty much medical STEM pilot. Analog space mission, you don't need to pilot anything. Maybe a drone, but you get trained to pilot the drone. You don't need to take your spacecraft and dock it somewhere. Might come later on, it's in discussion to obviously make things more real, but for the moment, you have no use for pilots in an analog space mission. The only thing that is actually great is that they have a lot of exposure to extreme environment and danger, so like those tough conditions. Now, the other thing is, although we have over 20 analog space missions, we don't have the same amount of applicants. If you look at the European Space Agency in 2021, when they made their call, they had over 22,000 applicants for 4 to 6 positions, plus maybe 20 backups. So yeah, toughest job in the world, yeah, probably. It's part implication. There might be a few more, but just to give you an idea, like for analog space missions, like you don't have as many applicants. You have lots of them, and you have lots of people doing missions for a few weeks, but it would never be 22,000 just for the same position. So you don't need to be as tough, and actually, usually you need to make the money, so you need people to come. If you are being too selective, you actually might not survive as an analog base, so you cannot afford to be as selective. And lastly, the financial and responsibility that are on astronauts is not the same as on analog astronauts. As analog astronauts, you sometimes have to represent your mission. You have to perform experiments. So if you mess up the experiment, you can make a scientist cry, or you can actually damage the reputation. But you will not make nationwide news, and you're not going to damage your country's or anything's reputation. You're going there usually as an individual. So the people you impact is still 80 or 100 people, maybe a little more, but it's not an entire country and it's not an entire agency. The way that European Space Agency works, for example, is that you have countries of I think 24 now member states, something like that, might be wrong, but all those member states do send money to them, and then it has to allocate to, for example, Earth monitoring, space exploration, human space exploration. And then they have to select astronauts according to this, and those astronauts are ambassadors. Those astronauts are the face of the European Space Agency and their country for as long as their term lasts. So all the money, all the taxpayer money that's been going in there and there and there, goes to the satellite data, the Earth monitoring, and those astronauts. So it's an enormous amount of money that goes in there, and it's years of training. It's the missions. I mean, just a seat on a Soyuz used to be, what, 3 million? It is really not the same as an analog mission. And doing an analog mission, sometimes you pay for yourself. So the only person really losing money is you. You don't have the same responsibility that you would have as an astronaut. So we don't need you to be as perfect as an astronaut, if there's such thing as a perfect astronaut. Now, let's talk about the rules. There is a variation in rules, but typically 5 main rules come in. The commander, for example, is one that you always have. Why? If everything goes well, you don't need the commander. The commander is basically your leader in case something goes wrong, and someone that will make sure that everybody's fine. Not in a half-wise only, but just to see, how's the crew dynamics? How's the mission going? Is the mission being impacted by this astronaut's feeling unwell? Are they feeling unwell physically? Was it something in their mind, like are they feeling not motivated? Are they feeling the quality is not good? If you sit down with that astronaut, you go and you check on them. Are there any tensions between astronauts? Understand your crew, understand how you will solve things. So during the day, you will do lots of little tasks, from checking that everything's done on time, that astronauts do their job correctly, that your mission control center is satisfied, that everybody does their roles, but you won't have to do any big things. The big things come if there's a big problem. I don't know, there's a simulated moonquake, there's a fight between astronauts, there's a problem with the mission control center, there's a problem in the flight plan, and the astronauts also need your help. These are the moments that you need to take leadership. When you have a dangerous situation, if people don't necessarily know the protocol, normally you always have a protocol in analog missions, but still, if they don't know the protocol, if they're not sure, they will follow if you guide them. So you take one person, you take charge, and you say, okay, you follow me and you do this. In some missions, you train with your crew quite a lot, so you get to know them quite well, and that gives you the opportunity to really understand them, and you can really see what the crew dynamics are and how they will behave during the mission. If some of them do not respond correctly to feedback when you're on one-on-one, then you have to give feedback in a group, or the opposite. Some of them enjoy praise, some of them are not very confident, some of them need to improve stuff. This is stuff that as a commander you should be able to read and you should be able to work on. You should be able to come to your crew and say, well, that person's like this, that person's like that, that person's like that. They will need my feedback like this, they don't need feedback, they need support this. And it's something that you also talk with your crew and prepare them for. You have to be excellent at communicating because of this, and also under pressure. If the commander loses their head, you better hope that there's a second one. Usually there's a vice commander, so one of the other astronauts will be a vice commander in case the commander gets ill or breaks a leg before, or for some reason has a problem during a mission. But basically the commander is really needed. You need that person in case. In a perfect world, you wouldn't need them. All the astronauts would be perfect, performing correctly, mission control center communication would be perfect, and the mission would be on time. It's never the case. It's never the case. There's always something that happens, minor or big, and you have to have somebody in the base that can take leadership. Usually it's also quite important that you have a good relationship with Mission Control Center. If the commander does not have a good relationship with Mission Control Center, then they can lead the whole crew outside of the mission scope and rebel, and which sometimes could be justified. Obviously, if the Mission Control Center is not doing things correctly, but normally Mission Control Center has the last say. Why? Because they know more. They are 80, 100, 1,000, depending on what your mission is and your crew is. People who worked on it, who have access to internet, have access to PIs, have access to experiments, to protocols, etc. You are usually a puppet. You do what you are told. So disobeying an order might actually really impact the mission, because usually they know more. However, you inside the base see some different things. It could be that they do not have the real feel of what's going on with your crew, what is going on inside the base, and that's your job. It's your job to communicate with them, and then if there's a discrepancy, then okay, well, maybe you're separate. But that should really never happen unless there's a really big problem, in which case the whole mission was not going to work anyway. You should really try to make sure that Mission Control Center and the crew get along. Sometimes it feels bad when there's orders being barked from one side and another, and this is where you are going to be the tampon zone. You're going to be the buffer. You're going to help in getting those relations to still work. Everybody's going to get tired doing the mission, both the Mission Control Center and the astronauts. That's something that just happens. It's normal. It's a tough environment. You shouldn't get too tired. You should be able to say, look, my crew is feeling overworked. We need to work the flight plan. And you have to really stress on this. You have to be confident enough and simply attentive enough to what your crew really, really needs. And you can also back this up with medical data, because usually the crew is being monitored. There's a lot to say about the commander role. It's something that is very enjoyable to do, depending if you're the kind of person that leads. I think really the most important thing is to really look at your crew and take time to understand them as individuals, take time to look into the different personalities. What do they like? Simply, what's their pet peeve? What is a no-go for them? How do they need to calm down? And what do they really enjoy? And then you just adapt. You know, if they need to have a big laugh, let them have a big laugh. If they need space, give them space, especially space on the moon. But really just adapt for crew. The communications officer is a role that is quite important, because if you don't have mission controls, then they usually cannot really do the mission that well. So they're usually responsible to check, for example, the Wi-Fi, to check the backup systems, to check maybe any external communication. Usually you have the Wi-Fi that is used, for example, communication with Mission Control Center, but you also need communication for extra safety. So for example, you might have an extra phone that has a special network that can call the emergency services in case something happens to one of the astronauts. Background in information and technology is not always needed, but it's quite useful just in case you have lots of programs to operate. Usually they're the ones you also help in maintaining softwares. You can have quite a lot of different software, some that contain the flight plan, the inventory, but also just for measurements, so experimental measurements. You might be using some different softwares and you might not be used to them. That person is responsible for maintaining this and just checking. Usually you wake up in the morning, have breakfast, check the Wi-Fi, check all communications are fine, open up the flight plans, look at all the computers, look at the backups, and then your job is done. It's not necessarily an easy job, because there's almost always a small kind of failure. There's always a little computer who's not working, or the battery's down, or something needs to be checked. But it is quite useful and quite interesting. Other roles. Sorry, it seems like my face is on some of the slides. I will send you the slides separately. Other roles, medical officer always needed, again, because you're in isolation, because you're not accessible easily. The medical officer has both a first aid training and extreme medicine isolation medicine training. So if you need to be amputated, they're your people. They're not necessarily medical doctors though. So if you have no medical doctors in your team, you will simply train normally not one but two people. Why? Because if that medical officer has to pull out of the mission at the last minute, or for some reason is impaired during the mission, then you need a backup. So having two medical officers is really good, and also they can check on one another. For example, if you are psychologically unstable during the mission for whatever reason, you might not see it. If you're the medical officer, then it might really impair your judgment, you might do some mistake, and that can impact the whole crew. So having a backup can tell you, look, you're not doing well, your fever is way too high, or you're psychologically not okay, you cannot work like this, you can't do the assessment. What kind of daily tasks do they do? Usually they monitor health values of the crew. So they, for example, can take your blood pressure, check your eyes, check your responses time, reflexes. If you have any medical issue, just a headache, a cut, you can ask them. You can do it yourself, but usually they're actually there for that. And if you have something worse that happens, like for example, when you do an EVA, the one of the medical officer will be ready for the EVA, so in case, or they will be out with you, so they can provide help, and they can say, well, did that person hit their head, did they do this? And the other thing that they do is they relay the information to what we call the biomedical engineer, which is on the mission control center. They will usually have close relationship with that person and be able to say, well, this is what happens. And then the biomedical engineer is a doctor, or in touch with a doctor, is a doctor in training, and they can really say, well, actually, this is a red flag, we need to evacuate that person outside of the base and compromise the mission, or keep on doing the mission, but check these vitals, etc. So they're not on their own, they have this connection to the mission control center. One thing that's worth noting, in some Analogue missions, they do impart a time delay between communication. For medical values, that's not done. So the medical doctors that are on the mission control center, or ground support operations team, do have in real time access to those vitals. It's just for safety reasons. That's where you can breach, in a way, the mission simulation. On Mars that wouldn't happen, but so far we haven't been to Mars, so far we didn't have to deal with that, and so far I think nobody had to get amputated doing an Analogue missions. Let's hope it is, or at least not that I know of. Two last roles. Payload officer. Payload officer is responsible for experiments. Doesn't mean that they develop all the experiments, but they should have a very good overview of all of them. All experiments have standard operating procedures, SOPs as we call them, and you should be able to have a look at them and perform all of the experiments, and basically replace if one of the astronauts cannot perform them. They are also responsible to have a look at the logistics for those experiments, sometimes developing part of those experiments, and their STEM background or a very, very thorough understanding of science is needed. I would say it would be very unlikely that you would take somebody as a payload officer if they didn't do any STEM before, because they simply won't understand. It would take them a lot of time to actually prepare for it and adapt. For example, biology, chemistry, physics, all very different fields in a way that you don't actually need the same equipment, the same requirements, and the same way you behave. Although to a non-scientist, they might seem quite similar. So I think it's quite important that you have somebody who really has a thorough understanding or a STEM background. And finally, the base engineer. Base engineer role will really depend a lot on how difficult the habitat is to maintain and the whole base. Most Analogue space missions are not under any vacuum or any pressures. It's not pressurized systems, so you don't have this extreme maintenance to do. But you do have stuff like the electricity going down, I don't know, the air ventilation, temperature, radiation sometimes, depending what kind of habitat you are. You can have lots of systems that can come down, and this is where you have to act. This is where you have to repair things. You have to understand how the base is made, what are some of the critical components of the habitats that you might need to maintain. Background in STEM plus not needed. Really mainly a good knowledge of how to repair the specific components or how things work, and just the training for the specific base. Always very useful. I know it's a pretty long course today, but hopefully you'll be very excited about it because it's It's got the word astronaut in it. But let's keep on. What is the analog astronaut training? Again, varies a lot depending on what kind of mission you're doing. There's the extreme environment training that's always done, but it can be done, for example, in the desert. It can be done in, somewhere extremely cold. It can be done while doing scuba diving, microgravity, testing and parabolic flights. Basically trying to get people outside of their comfort zone. It's very good for team building, but it's not always done because it's typically quite expensive. Nutrition training, also an optional training. Why is it useful? One very, not dumb, but thing that you might not realize is people will be under stress, and food will be quite useful for comfort. And it's also sometimes a way to get the whole team together. In some missions, you just have freeze-dried food, so it's easy to just put water in it and that's it. But you still need to have a look at the quantities, what they're eating, make sure that the whole crew is getting enough food. So having an understanding of what you're eating, how many calories you're going to need, how the exercise regimen and the activities you're going to have during the mission is going to impact your metabolism, and maybe you're going to be hungrier or less hungry than usual, is quite important. The other thing that you don't think is just your mood. You're stressed, you're tired. Knowing that these kind of food can really help with your mood, or that you have to be careful that your crewmate will eat you if you don't give them enough food, is really good. And lastly, one thing about nutrition is simply the hygiene part of it, safety. In habitats, often you don't have fridges, or you don't have any good storage system. You can have quite high humidity if you don't have proper ventilation, and that can really impact your food. And if you're sick in the habitat, then it's a big problem. Then it's you can't perform the mission. You have to change your whole flight plan. It's not good, and you also could get in danger because you're quite far away and maybe you didn't check the water, etc., etc. So having a look at how you store food, how you cook, how you mix things properly also helps. And also it can be fun. Some people like cooking, so it can be an activity that you can do. It's necessary, you have to eat, but it's also a fun activity to cook with your fellow analog astronauts. The base engineering training, we did go over this, obviously, for the base engineer. Medical training, by this I'm not talking just first aid, which is actually hidden by my face. I'm talking medical training for extreme medicine, so really like when you're in isolation, or when you're far away, or when it's very cold or very warm, where you wouldn't have normal resources and you have to maintain the patient until emergency services come there. If you expect the ambulance to be there in 5 minutes, it's one thing. If you expect them to be here in 1 hour, you probably won't behave the same way. So the people who do who behave as medical officers, they will have to have that kind of training. Leadership training, you'd think, well, some people are natural born leaders or followers. Actually, you can teach. Obviously, you will be having an inclination to be one or the other, or 50-50. But you can always improve as a leader, simply from your communication skills to your awareness to what kind of things might happen, and how you should simply communicate per person and act. Best advice I can say is lead by example. So if your team has to do something dirty, well, you take it on and you do it too. That's one of the simple rules, but it's not necessarily obvious to all. So those kind of trainings are quite useful, and especially for those who don't necessarily have a leadership role, but we have to lead because they're the expert of the field, such as the payload officer or the communications officer. Psychology tests or training are also quite useful to understand how your crew is going. So it's not team training I'm talking about. It's just, for example, understanding what is taking in other people's brains and how you can take care of them, basically. And also, how is your crew going to feel? Usually 2/3 of the missions is when people have a dip in wellness and just motivation. It's important to know that, just so you can anticipate and prepare for it. And psychology is probably one of the biggest factors in human space exploration. I mean, if we don't manage to get enthusiastic and to stay happy in space, we won't manage to be doing long journeys to Mars and beyond. So psychology, obviously, extremely important, and also just safety, right? If you're able to control your crew, calm them down, then the mission will be fine. If you have no clue at all, then you're already starting on the wrong foot. But team training doesn't need to be anything specific. Usually it's just about getting to know your crew, getting to know your fellow teammates and how they behave, how they, like, for example, are they very noisy? Are they very, depending on food, for example, some of them are moody when they don't eat enough, and this is something you don't know until you spend 3 or 4 days with them, and they suddenly you see they haven't had their snack and they get really, really hissy. Normally you try to filter those people out, but unless you actually done training with them and spend time with them, it's the things that you don't know. What you have to understand is, as analog astronauts, you're going to be roommates with them, you're going to be colleagues, you're going to be their boss, and you're going to be their employees, and also their friends, almost family. So it's a very complex relationship. It's not a kind of relationship where you say, well, I won't have to see that person, I'm going home. Home is work. It's the same thing. And also you have to cook with them, and you have to use the same bathroom. So if one of them is dirty and the others are clean, already you have a conflict. So simply getting to know your team helps you in just saying, well, actually, I know that person is not usually on time. Let's try to plan accordingly. Or that person is very, very organized and it stresses when we don't do things correctly. Let's try to find a compromise between the two. Obviously, normally it's people that are easy to live with, this is why they've been selected, but people are very different and people are human beings, and when you put them in isolation and under a lot of workload, those traits will come out very, very much. The longer and the more stressed they are, the worse it's going to get. So if there's already friction in the beginning, if there's already some stuff, you need to solve it before. You need to know what kind of defense mechanism you're going to use to make sure it doesn't blow up and jeopardize the mission simply because one sneeze is too loud or chews with their mouth open, whatever it is, basically. EVA training is the training for both the spacesuits and also going out. It just saves a lot of time. Media training is quite an interesting one. Basically, a lot of those missions need sponsors, people need exposure, people want to do experiments, people want to be taken seriously. So the more widely spread the knowledge about those missions is, the more you can just get the money and get higher quality missions. By knowing how to talk to media, by knowing how to share this knowledge, you can also have a wider pool of people applying for this mission and then be a bit more selective about them, increase the quality. A lot of people do not know how to talk to media or do not know how to do YouTube videos simply because they're shy or they never had to, and simply telling them, well, you can do these things to start with will give them confidence, and then it will usually naturally develop as they have more and more interviews coming in. Sports and physical training is the training that's not necessary but often takes place because you're going to use some specific equipment. So usually habitat's not that big, so it's good to have just a checkup with the astronauts so they know what they're doing. Not everybody is an athlete, not everybody knows how to use every machine. Making sure that they don't break their backs on it is good. The other thing that you can do is when you train them physically, you can make sure that they fit enough to be in the mission. When you do the medical tests, you don't necessarily do a physical test. So you could have a good lung capacity, you can be healthy, but by putting you under a lot of stress and isolation, you might be pushing a little bit. So making sure that they have a good fitness level, that they won't suffer going any place. Like, for example, what was discussed, that doing high seas missions, you do have sometimes to climb some quite steep slopes, and sometimes you're wearing a EVA suit. Spacesuits can be quite heavy. It's good if you fit. You don't need to be perfect, but it's still good because it might impact you negatively. And then one of the biggest training is on the experiments. If you have 10, 12, 15 different experiments, you need to know how to perform them. And then the more you know how to perform them, the better you will be able to say, well, actually, I saw this problem, or you can anticipate how much time it's going to actually take. Obviously, usually it's been calculated before, but during the mission, often the time is quite different. I did summarize on this slide what I said. There's a few that are not in the list, but normally you should have the gist of it. So just like, you know, what's the purpose of that training? What can we get out of this? And that's it. So it's just a very I would say, helpful slide for all of you, but I don't need to go into details. I just want to mention one thing about the experiment training. When you train, you often do it in the lab, and sometimes when you get back to your habitat, it actually really changes things, because you don't have the same machines sometimes, or you're not in the same temperatures and same controlled environments. So even though you do a training on experiments and you test the equipment and you test the protocols, when you move it to the habitat, it's usually quite different. And that's why that training is important. It's important because you need to already know quite a lot, so that the unknown will be okay. That you just need to call mission control center and say, look, we're missing that little part, whether try to do something with that or the equipment. The more you know, the more trained you are, the more confident you are, really. And this is the whole purpose of Analogue missions, is basically just to train you to get ready for the unknown. A little mention about well-being. A happy Analogue astronaut will perform better. That's usually always the case for everybody. You work better if you're happy. The heavy workload organization will actually impact the well-being. I mean, even if you love what you do, it is still usually a heavy missions, and we try to make sure you get enough sleep. But still, it's not a standard environment. So it will impact you. And you need to make sure that the astronauts are okay. You don't want them to lose their heads. You want the mission to work well. You want them to have a good time. And usually, at about 2/3 of missions, there's a dip in morale. There's a dip in motivation, because it's just, you more than halfway from the mission, but you still have quite a bit to go through. And that usually is seen even in submarine crews, astronauts, whatever. Like it is something that is known and seen. And a way to cope with this is to actually, for example, make a hole in the flight plan and say, well, during 4 or 5 hours, the astronauts don't do anything. Like they have a kind of weekend for a few hours where they'll just chill together or watch a movie, have a disco ball, whatever it is, and they can select this beforehand. You can put some toys or things like this they could use in the base for that precise moment. But it's good to have that in mind, that you're going to have to give them a bit of time for themselves. And speaking of that, you also need to give them time to connect with Earth. So for example, having them have a 15 minutes, half an hour session with their family, maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks, where they really just connect with the outside world. In some missions, as mentioned, there's a time delay, so they wouldn't be able to have a back and forth. In which case you could say, well, every 2 days they have 15 minutes to exchange emails, for example, or record a message and watch messages that are sent by their family. That really helps just in them getting outside of the crew and, getting back to Earth. Other things you can do is, for example, have plants inside of them and just have them touching the plants, especially if you do experiments with aero and hydroponics, where you have those plants. Seeing green, seeing and touching things can really help them in staying connected with Earth, and you can also improve the habitats itself to make it look nice. Lastly, a thing that you can do is to monitor well-being is to have logbooks. The biomedical engineer in the mission control center would have access to those logbooks and can see if there's anything going on that the commander might not have seen, the rest of the crew might not have seen, because it's kind of almost private book. Obviously the astronauts know that it's being read by the biomedical engineer, and the biomedical engineer can just then decide, actually, that astronauts, there's red flags, we need to check this and this. So it's also a way for the astronauts to vent. The BME won't be telling anything if there's nothing, worthy of attention, if there's no big red flag. They don't need to say that the astronaut was moaning the whole logbook. I mean, moaning is fine, it's good, you have to vent. But if there's any red flags, they're actually also there, and they can talk about that. Let me change. Here, so you can zoom on that slide. This is an example of a flight plan. It's actually the flight plan that was used during MID-20 by the Austrian Space Forums and the mission that took place last year. You can see on the left the people. You can see what they the position in the crew or in the support center, and you can see what time they start. So, for example, the astronauts were starting at 6 a.m. With breakfast, and then, for example, some of them have donning, so this is when you actually put on the spacesuit. So you can see it takes quite a few hours. The Austrian space room has those absolutely massive spacesuits that are extremely beautiful, but yeah, quite heavy, about 50 kilos, and do need some help to put them on. So they have to prepare this quite large time, and then they do the EVAs, and you have the doffing, then you have to have a debrief, and then sometimes you have lunch, and you have experiments. So you can see that the whole time, except when they sleep, the whole time of their day is planned from morning to evening. Sometimes it's 6 in the morning till 10, some missions are 7 till 11, depends. But basically, for every astronaut and analog astronauts, you have those flight plans that are very, very tight, and that you also have to be very flexible. Often those flight plans will move around. But yeah, so basically this is how it looks like for an astronaut. Depending on your role, as we mentioned, you'll be doing different tasks, but usually they will try to, for example, give the same number of EVAs to astronauts to make sure, you know, all of them get to spend some time outside, or this doesn't seem unfair, and or give them the tasks that they enjoy the most, or that they perform well. So there's also more enjoyment and therefore higher yield in the performance in the experiments. In day of a life of analog astronauts, the need for sport is not as critical as in space. In space, the main reason for sport is simply because you have massive muscle and bone degradation. They're not as engaged as on Earth, and if you don't maintain them, you would come back to Earth like a worm. You wouldn't be able to stand up, even with the training, 2.5 hours of training per day, every day. Astronauts still come back and have problems, you know, endovascular system, etc., etc. It's improving. We're looking for solutions over time, but still, I mean, they do suffer a lot of damage. When you're an analog astronaut, you don't have the problem, mostly. I mean, you don't do microgravity, or not that often, not that long, maybe 10 minutes maximum. So you don't have that problem. You don't have physically the need to. But for simulation purposes, it's good to do it. And the other advantage is sports is naturally good for you. It helps you also have some me time, helps you improve your mood, helps you just get your energy back and make sure that you stay healthy. So all analog missions have fitness facilities in them, so people can not only pretend to be astronauts, but also just generally keep healthy. Experiments, base maintenance, communication, MCCs, EVAs, basically it's almost all same as astronauts. Everything you do during a mission is important. Even the time that you have with your family, it's interesting from a psychological standpoint. Like, oh, is 5 minutes enough? 15 minutes enough? Everything you do is important. It's actually one of the wonderful things about being an analog astronaut and being an astronaut, is you are getting a pick, but not in a bad sense. In the sense that even you snoring is a probably good indication of that the mission is going well. So everything you do is useful, from cooking to cleaning to base maintenance. Base maintenance is typically not as intense for an space mission as it is for the International Space Station, because it's not as complex and it's not as subjected to extreme environments, or not as much as International Space Station. So you have way more time for experiments, but still, your schedule is full, as we saw before. You have some additional activities you might not think of, like the logbooks we mentioned, the inventory. The more details, the more of those tasks you have, the more akin you be to real analog space missions. So, like, you know, just making the communication checks really regularly. Intra-crew briefing normally is good if you debrief with your crew, for example, at lunch. And with Mission Control Center, you do it in the morning and the evening, and you can do some extras. Some crews don't do it, but it's good to have this naturally implanted on it. Housekeeping, so simply keeping the whole base clean and making sure that you have this turnaround, so it's not always the same people cleaning. Make sure it's in the flight plan, really helps in getting the mood okay, not getting annoyed that, oh, that person did not clean that. Media outreach, also we mentioned, can be, it doesn't happen every day usually, and it won't always be the same astronauts, but helps in promoting everything. And also it's a way to stay linked to outside and be proud of what you do and share it with the rest of the world. Then leisure time, family contacts, that's more once a week or every 2 or 3 days. So all those activities happen during the flight plan. Analog astronauts really vary, much more than astronauts do, because that depends on, again, the recruitment type and the training that I had to undergo in the mission duration. I mean, some missions are 6 months long and others are just 2 days, so you don't need to recruit necessarily the same people for that. Although they could have very similar activities. I mean, if you're doing some, hardcore exploring, you have to inflate the habitats in a lava tube, you're gonna want to recruit your people correctly. And yeah, I hope that this was very informative for you. Good luck on your test. I'm judging you, and so is Neil Armstrong, but hopefully this was complete enough, and if you have any questions, you can always contact me and ask me anything.